So good morning, all of you. Today, welcome back to our 7th lecture, which is a very important lecture, of course. It is a lecture on Modernism in America, Part 1. And today we have among us Dr. Sunaina Jain, who teaches English in MCMDV College for Women, Chandigarh. She has 10 years of teaching experience. She has worked on ecofeminism, and her thesis was titled as Changing Configuration of Spirituality, Mapping Ecofeminism in the Selected Novels of Alice Walker. As an avid reader, she likes to read widely and also loves to dabble in different genres of writing, critical as well as creative. She has presented papers at national and international seminars and has published many research papers in referred national and international journals, some of which are in New Academia, Dialogue, in Mellow Journal, and New Horizons. She has authored a book, Communication Skills, published by Milestone Publishers, New Delhi, and has contributed a chapter entitled Survival and Identity, a study of Elie Wiesel's Night and Primo Levi's survival in Auschwitz, in a book titled Literature, Society, and Politics. She has edited a book titled Happiness and Eternal Quest of Being, published by Authors Press. Her poems have featured in a number of literary journals such as Nuances, Dialogue, Hands India, Spark Magazine, and South Asian Ensemble. Her poetry has also got published in international anthologies, including Shout It Out by Lost Tower Publications, London, Tranquil Muse, Acrylis Anthology Selecting the Best, published from America in 2018, and Multilingual International Anthology, Amravati Poetic Prison 2017 and 18. Her short stories have also been published on the blogs of Out of Print Magazine, Muse India, Nuances, The Indian Review, and Indian Revolutions. She is also a panelist reviewer of Muse India and has reviewed books of varied genres, including short stories, travelogues, and poetry collections. On behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, ma'am, we welcome you. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and taking on this mammoth task of discussing one of the most important phases in two parts called the Modernism in American Literature.
So, a very good morning to all, and thank you for such a warm welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We welcome you on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE and our participants. The platform is all yours, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Shaikat Banerjee, for such a warm welcome. A very good morning to all the participants. You have already attended, other lectures in this series. So this is in continuation, where I'm going to take up modernism in America. Right. Purposely, I have not mentioned the timeline because, you cannot easily demarcate any era. And there are overlappings, there are bound to be overlappings. So generally, we would be covering, the period after First World War to the 1950s, after the Second World War, covering 1950s as well. So yes, this session, in fact, these two sessions, because this is the first in series and I'll be taking up another one as well. It aims at providing you the social, historical, and political context of the modern era in America. It will apprise you of the impact of the world wars in general, World War I and II, and the implications, on the larger literary scene as well. A broad overview of the Roaring Twenties, that is the 1920s, the lost generation, Depression era, the fallacy of the American dream, etc. I would also be providing you an insight into the Harlem Renaissance and the Beat generation of the 1950s. Please, somebody, Sidhu Tekur, could you please, the image is flashing and it is a little disturbing. And I'll also be providing you a comprehensive account of the major writers of the modernist era, including the poets, novelists, playwrights, and their literary accomplishments. So this is the objective. And yes, is this slide visible to all?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Okay, so modernism in American literature. In 3 words, I can sum up everything I have learned about life. It goes on by Robert Frost. So this basically, sums up what I am going to take up in these 2 sessions, because this was an era which was characterized by the 2 world wars, by the Great Depression. In spite of everything, literature flourished, literature bloomed in these times, and life moved on, right? So modernism in American literature, America entered the 20th century, optimistically as a wealthy, powerful nation. And although this time period began with on a note of, promise, on a note of prosperity, it soon became characterized by the 2 world wars and a severe economic depression. And these events ushered in a new age in American literature, modernism, as writers attempted to express modern life in their writings. And this era was characterized by a break from the earlier notions, from the established notions, from the traditional styles of poetry writing, other types of writing. This was the time when imagist movement, came into being. It was an Anglo-American, movement which came into being. Then we see a lot of writers experimenting with expressionism, which was a German movement. So writers began to experiment with different styles of writing, and this one, they earned America an international acclaim. But at the same time, so this was basically a period of, when art flourished, and people indulged in extravagant living also, which was a prequel to the Great Depression, because Great Depression would, completely change the landscape. So major themes of modernism were confusion and disillusionment. Of course, it is very, evident because of the world wars. People, there was, these confusing thoughts among people, and the chaotic literature also revealed the instability of, the minds of American people, where they were struggling and grappling with what was going around them. So you see, themes in literature also reflected the general paranoia, the general anxiety of the people, how people were disillusioned, they were depressed, they were frustrated, and the mood was apocalyptic, because war was going on and nobody knew. There was, no certainty about future. So the mood was apocalyptic. Then, because of depression, economic conditions had deteriorated in America. So you see representation of working class life also, their hardships, their struggles, and art was politicized. Art was politicized because writers were taking it as a serious vocation. They were trying to, represent the struggles, the hardships, the disillusionment of the era, and also because a lot was happening on the political front, and somebody had to, writers took up this charge to, portray those conditions as well. And above all, there was a nostalgia for the stability of the past. Past was stable. They were living a life which was relatively more stable. That there were no apprehensions or fears as such. And despite everything, this was a period of intellectual ferment, and there were a lot of formal thematic innovations. And at the same time, writers struggled to, they tried to represent the psychological crisis of people. So not just the exterior, but the interior state of mind as well. Generally, this was an era which was characterized by a loss of faith, loss of hope. There was a collapse of morality, values, which people had been, clinging on to in the past. And there was loss of hope in the American dream. We would talk about the American dream. Yes, impact of the First World War. So America's entry into the First World War was relatively late. It joined, this bandwagon of, or as a major belligerent, almost 2.5 years after the battle had begun. So, considering the fact war, took place outside the periphery of America, considering, it joined it, relatively late. So people can generally assume that war did not have a major impact on America or an American culture, literature, but the literature argues otherwise. And talking about the First World War, it is also known as America's forgotten war. See, America's position on the global stage as the supreme power, as the, as the world power did not exist till the second world war ended. So after first world war, because it had taken place outside the territory of the US, and there is relatively a very small accounts or less accounts available, which can validate that it had a lasting impact on the memory of the people. So it can be called America's forgotten war also because America's position had not been cemented as a superpower by this time. And just like other wars, the literature also was divided into pro and anti-war works. Why? Because there were people who were very happy with the decision of America going into the war. There were people who hailed and glorified war, and there were people who saw the other side. So in all, we cannot, again, very easily compartmentalize these works into two categories, pro or anti. We see there had been mixed reactions which characterized most of these works. And cynicism about war, it started manifesting in the late 20s. Excuse me. And Harold Laswell, he opened Pandora's box with propaganda techniques in the World War in 1927, because this gave an account of how Britishers had maneuvered and manipulated America to make an entry into the war. Yes. So we have, works where which are divided into, there was a pro-war tide, there was an anti-war. There were people who were very enthusiastic and excited about America's participation in the war, and there were people who were disillusioned with this idea. So F. Scott Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise, it showed the disillusionment, it showed the spiritual and moral, hollowness and disintegration of people. And also oppositional poetry, it began emerging from different nooks and corners. There was this women's peace party which was organized in early 1915. They started writing verses, poetry which criticized war. Then there were socialist and trade union organizations. They also provided outlets for anti-war poetry. And in the midst of everything, we have a figure, Alan Seeger, who emerged as the literary spokesperson in favor of the war, right? And his signature poem, I Have a Rendezvous with Death, this is very famous and was cited as the one which glorified war, which glorified America's participation. And I would just like to read out a few lines from this poem. I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes round with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death. When spring brings back blue days and fair. So see, spring here is not associated with rebirth, reunion, revival, new life. Spring here is associated with rendezvous with death, and he glorified it. There's another poem by Alan Seeger. It is Ode in Memory of American Volunteers fallen for France, and it was written shortly before he himself was, cut down by machine gun fire in July 1916. And this romantic, because he was, hailing all these, upholding these romantic ideals about, war and soldiers. And this poem, Ode in Memory, this elicited a direct response from one of the characteristic writers of post-war disillusionment, and that was Ernest Hemingway. And there's a poem written by him, Champs d'Honneur, and he wrote, "Soldiers never do die well." See, this is in marked opposition to what Alan Seeger was saying. Soldiers never do die well. Crosses mark the places. Wooden crosses where they fell, stuck above their faces. Soldiers pitch and cough and twitch. All the world roars, red and black. Soldiers smother in a ditch, choking through the whole attack. So this is the real picture. This is the sordid reality of war, right? And there is another, element here, because we will be talking about African American literature also in the form of Harlem Renaissance. So a very famous writer, Langston Hughes, who was very actively, writing and involved in literary activities, promoting Black culture during this time. He had also, written a poem during this war, The Colored Soldier, and where, that is a dialogue between the speaker and the ghost of his brother. And this ghost of his brother, the brother had died in France fighting for America. So the dead brother assumes that the high, minded justifications for the war, which were given by the President, Wilson, by the Wilson administration, and also by another Black activist, W.E.B. Du Bois. We would be talking about him later on. So W.E.B. Du Bois had, justified African American participation in the war by saying that this is the time, they should stand shoulder to shoulder with their white brothers. They should, help America in winning the war, and that would be in the larger interest of the Black Americans also, and that would change the status, the position of the Black Americans. But did it actually happen? No. So this is a poem, The Colored Brother. The world's been made safe for democracy, and no longer do we know the dark misery. Now, this is what the dead brother who has, who has lost his life in war, he is assuming. He is assuming that the world's been made safe for democracy, and no longer do we know the dark misery of being held back, of having no chance. Since the colored soldiers came home from France, the dead brother's word hurt the living brother, because the living brother knows what the reality is. Nothing has changed for the colored people, for the Black Americans, for the minority communities. Nothing has changed. It was awful facing that boy who went out to die. For what could I tell him except, it's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie. Every word they said. And it's better 1,000 times you are in France dead. For here in the South, there is no votes and no rights. So he's talking about disenfranchisement. He's talking about disempowerment of, Black people, even after war would be over. And I'm still just a nigger in America tonight. So the niggers, that is a derogatory, a pejorative term for Black Americans. He says that even after war has ended, it has hardly, lifted the status of Black Americans. So these are, some of the responses to the war. And there's another figure, Percy McKay, as you can see on the slide here. He was well known in his day, but now known only to literary historians. And he had already anticipated America's involvement in the war. And he had, said that it was inevitable. America would have to jump into it. And Woodrow Wilson, who had accepted the stance of neutrality in the beginning, but that neutrality also, favored massively the Allies. And there is this McKay's sonnet, which, is a kind of an exhortation to the administration, to the American people, to rise up, and join in the war. American neutrality, this is the name of this sonnet, and it says, "Peace do we cry, peace is the godlike plan. We love and dedicate our children to. Yet, England's cause is ours. Being American, our souls cannot keep neutral and keep true." Right? So, this is how America jumped into the war, and these are some of the responses. I just talked about. Coming from different quarters, coming from people. Some were in favor of war, some were, against war. And then I am going to talk about prohibition. Now, because war was conducted outside US territory, there was, on the surface, there was not much interruption or disruption in the normal activities in America. Yet internal concerns were there. Internal concerns figured large. And throughout 19th century, many states had passed legislations against alcohol. And because many social ills, many crimes were attributed to alcohol, and women were the one who were the loudest, advocates of prohibition, who were the major crusaders against, in the war against alcohol. So it was given constitutional sanction with the 18th Amendment in 1920. And we see, literature also reflected, this prohibition, got reflected in literature also, in the works of a few writers like Jack London's John Barleycorn, which is an autobiographical account of his own addiction with alcohol. Then drinking as a problem, it appeared in Stephen Crane's Maggie, A Girl of the Streets. There is another novel, Upton Sinclair's, novel, The Jungle, which was published in 1906 when prohibition was in force. That talks about the plight of immigrants who work in very harsh conditions, whose the masters are very exploitative, and how these people, in the course of time, the protagonist in this novel, he becomes an alcoholic. He goes on binge drinking, and everything gets disrupted in his life. So it is about the circumstances or the plight, the miseries of the workers working in the slaughterhouses and the meat packing industries. Yes, now we come to the Roaring Twenties. So this was the label which was given to the 1920s, right? After the First World War was over. And there were a lot of other labels used for this age, the aspiring age, the Roaring Twenties, the Gay Twenties, the Jazz Age, the era of excess, the mad times, the time of Fords, flappers, and fanatics. So these are some other labels because, generally the mood was very jubilant. People were very optimistic. Mood was, upbeat. After First World War, there was not much impact. Of course, there was post-war disillusionment. Still, we see, there was a flowering of literature and culture, especially during the 1920s. And jazz music became very, very popular. Jazz music, which was initiated by African Americans, so it was their product. And we would be talking about jazz music and jazz music when we discuss the Harlem Renaissance. So I'm not going to delve deep into the jazz music right now, but I'm just telling you that this was the decade which became very famous for jazz music, and it was popularized by jazz music, jazz poetry, which was popularized by one of the seminal figures of Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes. And this era, it witnessed unprecedented economic boom. There was prosperity. People were buying, automobiles. They were investing in electrical appliances. So all the material affluence of life, people were indulging in. Consumer culture was flourishing in the United States. And this achievement of, this material possessions, that became a goal of many US citizens. And this was also criticized, satirized by many writers of this era who were called Lost Generation. We would come to that also. And during this era of Roaring Twenties, when everything was, mood was upbeat, people thought, this could be called starting of or search for a new El Dorado, search for, more and more wealth. People were becoming wealthier, industrialization was setting in, factories were coming up, and many people defied prohibition during this time. There was indulgence in new forms of dancing, dressing up, people were spending money, and importantly, they were rejecting traditional moral standards. So those moral standards, ethics, the previous ethos, they, or the established ethos, they became a thing of the past. People were outrightly, rejecting those. But at the same time, despite this indulgence in hedonism, in, possessions of material gains, this was an age which witnessed a flourishing of art and culture. There was literary efflorescence and effervescence, which we can characterize, which we can, associate with the Roaring Twenties. But now we see another age, a period of economic depression is going to set in the United States, and the clock will be reversed. Yeah, so we talked about Roaring Twenties, but at the same time, we also have to talk about lost generation, because of course there was post-war disillusionment. And what was this lost war generation? These were a group of American writers who came off, who attained maturity, adulthood, during World War I, or immediately afterwards. So, and they established a literary reputation during the 1920s. Many of them, they moved to Paris in search of greener pastures, in the sense, where they could unleash their creative output in a better manner. And because there was a massive destruction which had been, war had wreaked havoc, so there was disillusionment in the minds of people, in the minds of writers, scholars, activists, about the ideals which have been associated with America so far, the idea of peace, stability, prosperity, and democracy. So everything was, going awry. It was going haywire during this time. And there was a wholesale rejection of traditional ideas of propriety, proper behavior, morality, ethics, gender roles. So everything was undergoing a change. And now coming to how this title was derived, Lost Generation. This title was derived from an actual verbal exchange which was witnessed by a writer, Gertrude Stein. She had witnessed a French, garage owner who was derisively calling his employee as, you are all a lost generation. So she came back and she passed on, she repeated the phrase to Ernest Hemingway, who used this in the epigraph of his famous work, The Sun Also Rises, which was published in 1926. So this phrase was popularized by Ernest Hemingway. And lost generation, because, this generation was wandering aimlessly. They had no aim. They were rejecting the established standards. They were rejecting traditional values. So in a way, they were all lost. And these writers I am talking of, F. Scott Fitzgerald, excuse me, John Dos Passos, E. Cummings, Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot, they often, depicted the internal turmoil which was going on, the struggles, the inner struggles, which was taking place in the minds and the hearts of these people who were the lost generation. Right? So you see two, contradictory things happening at the same time. Roaring Twenties, when people were, when there was a lot of prosperity, there was an economic boom, but at the same time there was also a generation who was, who was lost, who did not have any direction. They did not know where to steer their lives, towards. Yes, now coming to the American dream, we talked about it, and this term was coined by writer and historian James Truslow Adams in his best-selling 1931 book Epic of America. And you have to go back to understand what American dream meant, because you have to go back to the Declaration of Independence, which was given in 1776, and that the tenets, can be found in that declaration, which states, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So these were the ideals which were enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. American dream meant, anybody with merit, anybody by doing hard work with dedication could have upward mobility, could have a better social status, better standard of living, could achieve one's dreams in America. So meritocracy was to be given prominence according to the American dream. But it also assured, when we are talking of life, liberty, when changes, when catastrophes like war strike a nation, these ideals, they go for a toss, right? So American dream was a grand deception. Also, the fact, here I am using it in a narrow sense, but when we talk of ethnic minorities in America, when we talk of other racial communities, for them, especially African American population, Native American population, they were always, this idea of American dream always eluded them. They were never found place in the center of activities, in the center of mainstream America, and they were always pushed to the periphery. So these ideals always, these people were never able to experience the fruits of the American dream. So it was a grand deception on many fronts. And many writers, of course, they took up this this topic, this theme, the fallacy of the great American dream, or if not fallacy, generally what American dream meant. So F. Scott Fitzgerald's very famous work, Great Gatsby, we know that there are so many film adaptations, there are movie adaptations also, and it is shown how the narrator Nick Carraway, he comes to realize that Gatsby, who is the protagonist and who is the rich, man, who is a rich, wealthy man, how he has attained this much of wealth. So he gets to know that this vast fortune has been paid for with great misery. So this idea of American dream, of achieving American dream, is not what is actually enshrined in the Constitution. Right. So we have talked about the Roaring Twenties. We have talked about Lost Generation, the idea of the American dream. This also reminds me of another work, Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. So many of you might have read the book. That also represents the shattering of this idea of the American dream, right? So the Great Depression and the New Deal. Great Depression, many of you must be knowing that this was not an American phenomenon. This was a European phenomenon, but it of course affected America in many ways. Stock market crashed in 1929, and this ushered in an era of uncertainty, of a big slump, of economic depression. There was a large scale, massive unemployment. This was also a time when many millionaires, bankers, stockbrokers, they committed suicide. And there was widespread social distrust, unrest throughout Europe. This was the era of 1930s. So, there was rise of, dictatorships throughout Europe. We see the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany. We see the rise of Benito Mussolini in Italy. So there were many dictators who came to power, who grabbed power during this time. Coming to literature, this proletarian literature was published. It was the writings of many major authors. They reflected the lot, the plight of proletarians, the working classes, the rural, classes. And why did it affect America so much? Because compounded by drought, there was drought also. Depression turned the entire fertile agricultural land into what came to be called as Dust Bowl. So that fertility, and it was not depression which had actually caused uh, agricultural land, the fertile land to turn, barren. There were other reasons, because the culture of, monoculture, where, you keep on producing one type of crop, and that makes, that depletes the soil of its nutrients. So everything kind of, went wrong for the United States during this time. And in the field of agriculture, in the field of industry, there was a big downslide. And John Steinbeck, in his novel The Grapes of Wrath, he tells the story of Dust Bowl refugees. How there's a family, and there's a protagonist, Jode, who leaves his home and hearth in Oklahoma and moved to California in search of better fortunes, in search of, to earn their livelihood, because the land is all barren. So their hardships, struggles, miseries, exploitation, everything makes up, everything is woven into the plot of this novel, The Grapes of Wrath. But not just the miseries, their resistance to it as well. So that makes, any literature complete, because it is, showing some sort of a solution or a way out of that misery also. Yes, there is a protagonist, Jode, whose life has been turned upside down, but at the same time, he does not sit back. He does not, just lament over his fate, or over the, downslide of his fortunes. He fights back, he retaliates, and he resists, this exploitation. And that is the beauty of it. Then Tennessee Williams, he also uses poverty of depression as a backdrop in the play The Glass Menagerie. Though the Glass Menagerie, the theme, there are many other, there are many diverse themes in this play, The Glass Menagerie. But if we look at the backdrop as to why, the family has to, why there is a rift in the family, where, a mother, an obsessed mother is looking for a match for her daughter, and how that creates a rift. And how the dreams shatter for this poor girl. All of this can be viewed and understood when we come to understand the effects of depression. So it was in the backdrop of the depression that the family had become so poor. They had the least of resources, and that led to, bickerings in the family as well. So it shows the psychological scarring it left behind. Yes, recovery from depression, that is important. Depression was there, but America had to recover from it, and it did recover. And this period began with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt to the presidency. He became the president in 1933 and held office till 1945. And it was, through a series of, he launched, a series of acts which aimed to control inflation, stabilize prices, and provide unemployment plans to the unemployed men and women. And it also ensured old age support. So these policies did help in the recovery of depression. Many new jobs were created in the public sector. But important thing is that the real turnaround, the real change came with America's entry into the World War II, right? So how World War, in a way, helped America to come out of depression? See, because when America joined this war, there was an urgent need to manufacture armament. There was, other industries also burgeoned in the wake of, America's participation in the war. And this gave employment to women. This also gave employment to, Black Americans. And to a certain extent, yes, there was some sort of recovery from depression because of the need to create industries, need to manufacture goods, need to manufacture armaments. That was the reason America was able to come out of depression, and war became a major theme in America's national life. So, and it impinged on the national consciousness of America. And one of the important themes in literature of this century. Now, talking about America's entry into the World War II, I hope all of you know, and I'm sure you know, but let me just repeat it for you. How and why did America, how did war end? Uh, America had been attacked by Japan in the Pearl Harbor. They had attacked, Japanese had attacked the American fleet in 1941, and that made America, jump into the war with renewed vigor and energy, and with a new, found reason for revenge and vengeance, and it wreaked havoc because America then bombed the German city of Dresden before it launched a tirade against Japan. And there was this new thing during this war, the use of atomic bomb. The use of atomic bombs, which were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in 1945. It happened on 6th August in one city and 9th August in the other city. And on 10th August, Japan had to surrender unconditionally and had to bow down before the demands of America. And this is the time when America is the supreming, is the reigning force on the global stage. It has cemented, solidified its position, and other European countries, you see, have lost their preeminence. So this was the impact of World War II. It reflected in literature, but you see, America has become a superpower. And I just discussed a new element had entered the war, and that was the use of bombers to drop bombs on cities. Use of bombers, and that again is reflected in literature. And see, this a literary historian, Malcolm Cowley, described the years between the two world wars as a second flowering of American writing. Despite such carnage, despite destruction, despite millions of deaths, not only were millions killed in Japan and Germany and elsewhere, America also lost its soldiers. So despite everything, literature flourished. And we have a lot of works which reflect the impact, the implications of the Second World War. There is a work by Joseph Heller's Catch 22, right? So we have this hero Yosarin, who is a bombardier and who is trapped in to the B-25 bomber, which is it is ironically said that it is stable, it is reliable, dependable, but it has a tight crawlway and a narrow square cold tunnel. So this was it is all dealt with a tinge of irony, dark humor, black comedy, right? Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, Irwin Shaw's The Young Lions, these were also realistic war novels. And Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s Slaughterhouse-Five, that is also a mixture of dark fantasy and numb humor. All these literary pieces, they reflect the repercussions, the implications of World War II. So largely, by this time, I have talked more of the social, political, historical context, which which made literature possible. And this was a modern era in American literature. A modern era because it was a breakaway from traditional styles of writing. It was the time when writers were innovating, they were experimenting with new styles. There were new themes, structural changes in the form of writing. So all this led to flourishing of literature during this century. And the reason, if you are wondering why am I talking so much about World War, why am I talking about Lost Generation or Prohibition or the Great Depression, New Deal? That is because it is very important when you start reading literature. It is very important you have a certain a good grounding in the social, historical, political context, in the milieu of that particular era or decade you are reading or studying, because literature is not produced in a vacuum, right? So it has to have a certain context to it. All these events, the major events which shaped the history, which shaped the landscape of America, shaped and informed its literature as well. So that makes it very pertinent, very important that we have awareness about the major events which took place during this time. Right. So I have covered the major events so far, and now coming to the major writers, major poets of this era. I'll be taking up in a sequential manner, in the sense that I'll be taking up the poets first, then dramatists, and then novelists. So I'm not mixing it up here. And some poets, of course, there would be overlapping. Some poets might be writing short fiction or fiction as well, but largely, if we talk of Robert Frost, he is known as a major poet of America. So yes, coming to Robert Frost, a name which does not need an introduction, right? His work is principally associated with the life and landscape of New England. Some of you, and I think many of you, must have read his poetry, and you can easily associate that how his poetry was shaped by the sights, scenes, sounds of New England. And he was a poet of traditional verse forms and metrics. See, I had been talking about all the experimentation, innovation that had been happening on the literary scene, but of course there were a few poets who remained immune to it. They did not budge from their stand. They did not, give up their traditional style of writing, and Robert Frost is one of them. And despite not going in for experimental style, or not giving up his traditional verse form, we see he was the winner of 4 Pulitzer Prizes, right? And he was much more than merely a regional poet. When we say that his poetry is characterized by the sights, sounds of New England, this does not relegate him to a position of a mere regional poet, because that is not what he conveys. In his poetry. His poetry can be understood, comprehended on a much deeper level, because he talks about universal three themes by using very familial themes, familial images. He drives home a very profound messages in his poems. And why I like his poetry, it is because of his ambiguity. He leaves room open for multiple interpretations, and that is the beauty of his poetry. He was honored frequently during his lifetime, received 4 Pulitzer Prizes, right? His first book of poetry, A Boy's Will, was followed by North of Boston a year later. It was published in England. Now you must be wondering, I am covering him in as an American poet, but there were a few people who were expatriates and who traveled widely, who stayed in Europe or in other countries and then came back to their homeland, but were essentially American. So he spent some time in England with his wife. In England, he made some important acquaintances, including Edward Thomas. And in fact, Edward Thomas' walk into the woods was what had inspired him to write his very well-known, very oft-quoted poem, The Road Not Taken. So he made friends with T.E. Hume, Ezra Pound. These were the major literary figures, right? And this poem, The Road Not Taken, it is often read at graduation ceremonies across the United States. Also, here also, because The Road Not Taken, it speaks of universal dilemmas or predicaments, all the human beings face, at one point of time or another. Whether you were graduating from college, you are worried about your future, about your career, which stream to take. Human beings have this tendency to be at a crossroads, somewhere in their lives, when you reach at a junction where you have uh, you know similar looking alternatives available before you, and you have to make a choice. So the last line of the poem, and that has made all the difference, that again, has a room for ambiguity. What has made all the difference? So when you read this poem, you would understand how he uses very simple images, just a traveler who is standing at a crossroads thinking which road to take, and how after years, when he is retrospecting in hindsight, he is weighing his decision, whether he took the right decision at that time or not. So these are some of the problems, dilemmas, which all of us face. Okay, then World War, I told you that he spent some time in England. World War One had broken out in 1914, and as a result, he, along with his wife Eleanor, returned to America in 1915. And when he arrived home, he was already a well-established poet, because he had, published these volumes, A Boy's Will and North of Boston. So he was a known literary figure already, and was given a very warm reception by the readers, by America. The one thing which I want to touch upon when we talk about Robert Frost is he had a very clear understanding, or a clear stance about what a poem means to a reader. So he thought that the essential merit of a poem depends on how the reader takes it. So reader's understanding, reader's perception of a poem is very, very important. And that, in a way, guarantees merit and meaning to the poem. And that is what I like about his poems. When you read Mending Wall, when you read The Road Not Taken, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, it, in a way, it all depends on how you perceive that poem. That adds to the beauty, that adds to the meaning of the poem. And that, that perception, that comprehension enriches the poem time and again. His famous works include Fire and Ice, Mending Wall. Mending Wall, do you remember the last line? It's again a very often quoted, line. Good fences make good neighbors. Again, a very mundane, very ordinary event where the two farmers, they are building a wall, that touches their boundary, but it raises larger questions. It raises larger questions about boundaries, about barriers, about whether those barriers can be or should be collapsed. So it is not just a poem about mending a wall. These walls, or this wall in the poem, it may represent, it may, have multiple connotations. The wall of division, wall of compartmentalization, wall of, the boundaries or barriers which are, sometimes created by men, whether we can transcend those barriers. So you see how deep, how simple images used to evoke meanings which have a lot of profundity and depth in them. Then Out, Nothing Gold Can Stay, and Home Burial are some of the other important, works by Robert Frost. Dr. Shaikat, I have not been asking, am I audible, and are others able to listen
Yes,
to me?
ma'am, you're audible.
So yeah, should I continue?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Yes, the next writer, the next major poet is Carl Sandburg. He was a Swedish-American poet, biographer, journalist, and editor. won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. Robert Frost had won 4. He had won 3, 2 for his poetry and 1 for his biography of Abraham Lincoln. And he was celebrated for volumes of his collected verse, including Chicago Poems. Chicago Poems is a very, very, widely acclaimed, critically acclaimed collection by Carl Sandburg. Cornhuskers and Smoke and Steel, these are some other, collected poems written by Carl Sandburg. At his death in 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson observed that Carl Sandburg was more than the voice of America, more than the poet of its strength and genius. He was America. So this was a major, major, praise, showering of praise on this literary figure, Carl Sandburg. He was called, he had become an institution in himself. Languages was published in Chicago Poems. This is a very interesting poem also. And in 1916, alongside a collection of poems that pay tribute to the common man. And I would just like to read out for you this poem, Languages. Yes. So it is between your teeth and lips speaking, now and today, shall be faded hieroglyphics. 10,000 years from now, sing and singing, remember, your song dies and changes and is not here tomorrow any more than the wind blowing 10,000 years ago. I repeat, between your teeth and lips speaking, now and today, shall be faded hieroglyphics 10,000 years from now. Sing and singing, remember, your song dies and changes and is not here tomorrow any more than the wind blowing 10,000 years ago. So this is a poem. He uses language very cleverly, very wittily to describe language, whether it is the temporality of language, whether, it is about the developments, variations in language over the time, which we call, vernacular or slangs, which are developed in the course of time. And also how we try to grab language, how we try to hold on to language, but at times, it's slippery. Language is slippery, meanings are slippery. So he very cleverly, brings forth, weaves all these themes into this poem titled Languages, right? Yes. Now we come to the next major poet, E. Cummings. Are you wondering why have I decapitalized his name? Yeah, there is another, just to tell you, there's another Black American author, activist, and critic, literary critic, Bell Hooks, who also does not, capitalize her name. Though here the story is a little different. E. Cummings, I'll just tell you, outspoken, he had an outspoken flair and creativity, and these were the hallmarks of his verse. Expressed strong anti-war sentiments, and which landed him into trouble when he was working as an ambulance driver in Paris during World War One. He was very unorthodox, and we would just be, witnessing the same when I share one of his poems. He was very unorthodox, very experimental, when it came to his poetry. He abandoned all the traditional techniques. He abandoned all sense of punctuation, grammar, syntax, and he created a unique literary style for himself. And he was the recipient of multiple honors. He wrote 12 volumes of verse assembled in his 2-volume complete poems, which got published in 1968. So we were talking about Cummings' linguistic experiments, where he may use, inverted syntax at times. He may use, coinages or neologisms, newly invented compound words. Also, he can use very different text alignments where lines are spaced very irregularly. Maybe just a word is there in one line, maybe not even a word, right? So he is also known for non-traditional capitalization. If you read his poetry, generally he used I in lowercase. He never capitalized it. Now coming to why I have chosen to decapitalize his name. See, E. Cummings was known for his experimental style where he used decapitalization very frequently, but that does not mean that he did not use capital letters at all. In fact, there are evidences, there are instances which are very well known that he, in fact, put his signatures in capital letters also. But publishers thought when he was publishing his books and they, went through his poems and his writings where he was quite unorthodox about his capitalization, punctuation, they thought he would, he might, write his own name in lowercase only. So that is where the practice began. But E. Cummings never himself, declared that he would write his own name in lowercase. So that was a myth or a fallacy, you can say. In fact, his wife repudiated, this. In fact, she claimed that E. Cummings never ever, accepted this fact to decapitalize his own name, and it is a sham. It's not there. So she had rebuked the publisher for using, for decapitalizing his name. So that is the story, E. Cummings. So here, I purposely, kept it in lower case just to tell you the story behind it, so you can. It's your sweet will whether you want to capitalize his name or decapitalize his name. Though, as I told you, his wife was not in favor of decapitalization of his name, right? So E. Cummings was also known for subversion of traditional ideas. What is spring associated with? Spring is generally associated with rejuvenation, with rebirth, with renewal of life, with reunions, and all things rosy, all things positive in life. That is what we associate spring with. There are innumerable poems written on this, the favorite season of many authors and writers and poets. So what he does here is that instead of showering praises uncritically on spring as a time of rebirth, he describes spring as a slattern of seasons with dirty legs and a muddy petticoat, right? So that is how he takes up a traditional idea. He completely, upends it. He topples it upside down and gives a wholly new interpretation of it. Then there is an example of radical departure in his poem, A Leaf Falls on Loneliness. Now you just notice, yes, this is how the poem runs. There's not even a single word in a single line. If you see it, a leaf falls is in parentheses. Can you read that? And now you associate the first L with the last three. One, it's written L and ines. That means loneliness. A leaf falls, loneliness. So this is how he is expressing the loneliness, the aloofness of this leaf, and how he evokes that is again a complete subversion of the traditional verse forms, traditional meter, right? Now we come to another important figure, William Carlos Williams. Dr. Shaikar, please let me know if I'm going a little fast or, if there is any
Absolutely fine, ma'am.
disturbance.
No issues.
Thank you. So, William Carlos Williams, a Puerto Rican American poet, writer, novelist, playwright, and physician. So, all rolled into one, a very multifaceted personality who was closely associated with modernism and imagism, right? And his family provided him with a fertile background in art and literature. His father's mother, coincidentally, was named Emily Dickinson. Besides writing, he had a long career as a practicing physician, as a pediatrics and in general medicine also. With Ezra Pound and HD is Hilda Doolittle, another important, poet. So Williams was a leading poet of the Imagist movement and often wrote of American subjects and themes. And because of his tryst with Imagism, he made ordinary appear extraordinary because of the clarity, precision, and discreteness of his imagery. Now, coming to, we just, talked about the Imagist movement in passing, because I presume that most of you are quite aware of, have prior knowledge of what Imagist movement is. But just to, apprise you or, brush up, uh, it was an Anglo-American movement in the modernist poetry, and it was a revolt against romanticism in poetry. It was a revolt against traditional Victorian poetry, and it emphasized, simplicity, clarity of expression, precision, and the idea was to replace abstraction with concreteness. There, because otherwise, if you look at romantic poets, how they go overboard with emotions and feelings, how they use language, lot of flowery language also. But here the emphasis is on, that no word should be used unnecessarily. You have to create an image, an exacting visual image, right? And if you look at the precursor, Ezra Pound was, can be, labeled as the, can be considered as the founder of this Imagist movement. And this was again not a very, it was not originated or was discovered, invented by Ezra Pound. In fact, he relied much on the ideas of T.E. Hume, an English writer. So this Imagist movement, it had its precursor in Japanese haiku poetry. That also, gives a direct treatment of the thing, whether it is subjective or objective. And when we talk of Imagism, I would be sharing a very, very small poem, not now, but when we come to Ezra Pound. But I hope I've made it clear what Imagist movement was, where there was a emphasis on clarity, on precision of images, an emphasis on producing concrete images rather than diving into abstraction of any kind, right? And there was a direct treatment of the thing. You have to remember that. So William Carlos Williams, he was also one of the leading figures whose career was initially overshadowed by other poets, but he became a very, very important inspiration to the Beat generation in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, Allen Ginsberg considered him as his mentor and as his inspiration. So many Beat writers were influenced by William Carlos Williams. And he was known as an experimenter, innovator, and a revolutionary figure in American poetry. And in the 1930s, when the Great Depression struck America, when it wreaked havoc, it caused, there was such a big economic slump. His images, because he is a major leading figure of the Imagist movement. So what he created in his poetry were the images. his images became less a celebration of the world, and he started, cataloging all the ills and wrongs of the society through his poetry. And when we talk of cataloging, are you reminded of any other American poet who, used a lot of cataloging in his poetry? Anybody who can just name one American writer, a very, very known canonical American writer?
Participants, the chat box is open, so you can type what ma'am is asking. Ma'am, can you repeat the question once?
Yeah, the question is, when we are talking of cataloging of things, here, William Carlos was cataloging all the wrongs and social ills of the society. There is a major literary figure in America who used who used this literary device of cataloging in his major work. Who was that American writer? In fact, Allen Ginsberg was also, one of the writers of the Beat generation who used cataloging. But here, I am expecting, a name which is a very, very prominent name in the field of American poetry. Has anybody read Song of Myself, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman? So if you read Walt Whitman, he used a lot of this device of cataloging of things, cataloging of objects, cataloging of people, cataloging of natural objects. So that is what he used in his poetry. I hope I'm clear about it.
Yes, ma'am.
So could you just excuse me for a minute?
Of course, ma'am.
Where I left, we were talking of William Carlos Williams and his poems like Proletarian Portrait and the Yachts reveal his prowess, acumen in conveying attitudes by direct presentation of things rather than, delving deep into the details. Yes. The next poet is Wallace Stevens. And Wallace Stevens, again, one of America's most respected 20th century poets. He is a master stylist, employing an extraordinary vocabulary and a rigorous precision. See, one thing I want to make clear, because we are covering, way too many poets and novelists and dramatists, it would not be possible for me to, give a very detailed explanation of each and every writer, but I would try my best to cover the literary style of these writers, and probably comment on one or two of the literary pieces if I find they are worth explaining, because otherwise it is beyond the scope of these lectures that I can probably talk about these poets in much detail, right? So I am covering their style basically, and the school to which they belong, like William Carlos Williams, they belong to the Imagist movement, so like that. He viewed poetry as the supreme fusion of the creative imagination and objective reality. And many a time you see there was a lot of technical and thematic complexity, meanings were convoluted, style was convoluted, and he was labeled a difficult poet because of, these complexities in his work. He also worked as a journalist, and thereafter he began reporting for the New York Evening Post. And his first period of writing begins with his 1923 publication of the Harmonium Collection. And one very important poem from this collection is The Emperor of Ice Cream, which has otherwise, nothing to do with ice cream. So if I talk of The Emperor of Ice Cream, are you reminded of any fable, which starts with the emperor? Are you reminded of any fable? A short story for children. Somebody has posted in the chat box. Let me just check. All right. Yes, yes. Yes, exactly. But here, the title is very intriguing. The title is The Emperor of Ice Cream, whereas this poem is about death, the treatment of death, and it is about how reality must be stripped of all illusions. So that is the theme of the poem, but the way he presents it, the way he deals with the subject, with this theme, is very different, is very innovative. That is why he was labeled as a difficult poet, the Emperor of Ice Cream. And this poem again is ambiguous. It lends itself to multiple meanings. When you read it, you can cull out as many meanings as you want, I mean, according to your perception of the poem. Yes, the next poet is H.D. Hilda Doolittle. She wrote under this pen name of H.D. Hilda Doolittle, and her work spanned 5 decades of the 20th century, 1911 to 1961. Again, belonged to the school of Imagism, an important Imagist poet, known primarily as a poet. I told you there, would be certain poets who would also have dabbled in fiction, in non-fiction, in memoirs, essays. So she was also versatile in that sense, that she tried her hand. She wrote a lot of novels, she wrote her memoir and essays also, and did number of translations from the Greek. And her work, coming to memoir, it just struck me. Sometimes people use it interchangeably. What do you think? Uh, is there any difference between memoir and an autobiography? Anybody who wants to say something or comment on how is a memoir different from an autobiography? That's a very basic difference you should know. Okay. See, in autobiography, you would generally find a detailed chronological account of, author's life experiences, his or her childhood, then adulthood, maturity, till the time, he finishes his autobiography. It is a sequential account of his life journey. Whereas in memoir, he talks about, it's not a chronological account. It is related to his personal experiences. A poet might have encountered certain people in his or her life and wants to write about them. So it is about selective, being selective. It is about selecting certain events, experiences in one's life, and then putting them together in the form of a book that is a memoir. So it may or may not have anything to do with one's childhood. It may deal with just a decade in one's life, or just a period spanning 5 years or so, or maybe a year, and it can still be a memoir. That is not the case with an autobiography.
Yes, ma'am. Astha Sharma writes that autobiography is a detailed life experience of the author, and memoir are certain memories experienced by the author.
Yes, very right, Astha. Thank you. So her work contribute to the avant-garde milieu that dominated the arts in London and Paris until the end of World War II. She was an expatriate who, traveled a lot, who traveled to a lot of European countries, stayed there, and wrote from there. And the major themes in her works are love, war, birth, death. These are some of the central concerns which she incorporates in her works. And there is a story about her attraction, her infatuation with Ezra Pound. So by now, I think you remember Ezra Pound, H.D. Hilda Doolittle. They belonged to the same school. Richard Eldington was another one. They belonged to the William Carlos Williams. She knew both of them, William Carlos Williams and Ezra Pound. For Pound, she had feelings of love, and in fact, Pound was working as a professor, and even after opposition from her father, they got engaged. They had a brief period of courtship, but it was during the courtship, and after continuous opposition from the family, she started realizing that the romance was coming to an end. This was becoming a very, very mundane kind of a relationship. This is not what she was seeking from a relationship. In a way, she also thought that it was taking away her individuality from her. And later on, there were rumors about, even after their engagement, there were rumors about Ezra Pound's affairs with other women as well. So that shattered Hilda Doolittle, and that is how the relationship came to an end. But Ezra Pound remains her first love, and she remembers him in her memoir, End to Torment, and in a long poem, Winter Love. In fact, there are a few, she had ambivalent feelings about William Carlos Williams also. And she had befriended Sigmund Freud, a major psychoanalyst, during the 1930s, and she had become his patient. And because Hilda Doolittle was a woman who could not be stereotyped as an ideal, or as an ideal woman in those times, considering her liberating views about sexuality, she became Sigmund Freud's patient in order to understand, in order to make peace with her own sexuality, bisexuality, because she was in a relationship with uh, Pound earlier, and then she transferred her emotions to another, to another woman. Greg's was, her surname. So she was under the treatment. She also wanted to be at peace, or to understand, to come out of her residual war trauma, her writing, her spiritual experiences, all of that, weighed heavy on her, and she sought treatment of Sigmund Freud. And she became an icon for the LGBT rights. She did not know, of course, way back then. It was in 1970s and 1980s when these movements, LGBT rights and feminist movements, they gained momentum, that she became an icon. And there was a rediscovery of her writings. And during the 1950s, she wrote a considerable amount of poetry, most notably Helen in Egypt, where she was examining male-dominated, male-centered epic poetry from the perspective of, from a feminist perspective, right? And there were other famous collections written by H.D. Hilda Doolittle, Sea Garden, Heliodora, and other poems. Red Roses for Bronze, The Walls Do Not Fall, Tribute to the Angels, The Flowering of the Road, and so on. So she remained a major influence, a major poet, in the modernist era. Yeah. The next poet, Edna Vincent Millay, she was one of the most successful and respected poets in America, noted for her dramatic works also, including The Lamp and the Bell. There was a libretto which she had composed, The King's Henchman, and she also wrote lyric verses. Renaissance was very famous, and the poems found in her collections, A Few Figs from Thistles, 2nd April, The Ballad of the Harp Weaver, these were again very famous, and was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 1923. And like her contemporary Robert Frost, she was one of the most skillful, most consummate a writer of sonnets in the 20th century. And like Robert Frost, see, drifted away and did not experiment much with with he did not innovate much when it came to traditional, when it came to verse forms and meter. He did not. Edna, in the sense, she adopted Robert Frost's style also, but she combined, that style, the traditional style, with modernist attitudes, with, modern themes, and created a unique American poetry, created a unique style. And what went in favor of Millet was the fact she was a superstar when it came to the performance of her poems. So, apart from writing her poems, she performed. She performed a lot, and that was the major reason for her popularity amongst the crowds, amongst the people, because of her riveting, very engaging readings and her performance. She was highly appreciated. She was, endorsed as one of the major figures, and also very much known. Like HD, she was also known for a very candid, uninhibited portrayal of different types of sexual orientations, whether it was, homosexuality, bisexuality, heterosexuality. She would not, mince words when it came to expressing, her views about the same. And she was also very famous for her progressive political stances. That was something not very women would do, during those times. But she had a very firm stand on what she believed in. She dug her heels in, and she became, she heralded this, ideal of a new woman, where she would talk about uninhibitedly, without any restrictions, about female experiences, female expressions. Coming to the next poet, I think all of you must be familiar with T.S. Eliot. He also needs no introduction, was a poet, essayist, publisher, playwright, literary critic, and editor. Again, all rolled into one, a very versatile personality. And he exercised a very strong influence in the time period, between the two wars, between World War One and Two, and spent, some time, a lot of time, in fact, in London, in England, and moved to England in 1914 when he was 25. Went on to settle there. He worked there, married there, and became a British citizen eventually. And he renounced his American citizenship. But of course, he remains as a major figure, as a seminal figure when it comes to, uh, when we have to talk about, when we include the major poets of the 20th century in America. T.S. Eliot, remains at, can be kept at a very, very high pedestal. What was he expressing through his poetry? Basically, he was expressing disillusionment, hollowness, meaninglessness of life, sterility of modern life, and collapse of traditional values, collapse of moral standards, ethics in the post war era. And that is reflected in many of his poems. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is just one of them. Hollow Man is there. Then the major work of modernism, in the 20th century, which was which carved a, he carved a niche for himself when it came to expressing the post-war disillusionment, the spiritual degeneration, fragmentation of modern life. with this seminal work, The Wasteland, which I'm quite sure all of you must be very, very familiar with, and some of you might have read also, because that is, in fact, a representation that long poem is representative of that era, which was characterized by, these strong feelings of depression and disillusionment and disintegration of values. So all that is encapsulated in this work, The Wasteland, which appeared in 1922 and becomes the defining poem of the age. It is filled with fragments, competing voices, learned allusions. If you have read the poem, you would associate, you would relate very easily to what I am, trying to say, because he takes lot of references. It's a very eclectic in approach. He has drawn references from, many European works like Dante. He has also alluded to Hindu mythology. He incorporates, the myth of the Holy Grail and the Fisher King. And he kind of, fuses it with the contemporary British society. And if you read it, you might feel that it is very fragmented, but after you have read the entire piece, a message which springs forth from this poem is that of spiritual hollowness of the age. Is excuse Yes. So the poem runs into 434 lines, but that is not the original length of the poem. It was a very, very lengthy poem, which was cut short, which was edited a lot by Ezra Pound. So Ezra Pound had a major role in condensing portions of this poem, and the version which we read today was cut short, was edited much by Ezra Pound. So the credit, for editing goes to Ezra Pound. And initially there were not, footnotes attached, which T.S. Eliot added later on, because there are so many allusions to mythologies and a layman cannot make out. So there were references drawn from different sources. There is a usage of Sanskrit mantra also, and the book is divided into 5 sections, which might seem, at a first glance, very fragmented, very in a disarray, but that is not so, right? When you have read it, the message rings very loud and clear. The message is of spiritual disintegration of the air, of this age, and the need for redemption, the need for revival and redemption of values which have taken a downslide during this time. And after Wasteland, some critics, regard the 4 quartets as, again, a very, very influential work, where he digs his own past. He goes back to the past of the entire human race, collective consciousness, and the meaning of human history. Apart from these, he also wrote verse plays like Murder in the Cathedral and The Cocktail Party. Murder in the Cathedral, again, is a very intriguing verse drama, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948. Next, we move on to Ezra Pound, who advanced. We have talked a lot about Ezra Pound, by this time. So you are already familiar with Ezra Pound. We have talked about his relationship with H.T. We have talked about how he was a major influence on T.S. Eliot. And when we read about him, we would get to know more about him, how he was influential, how he shaped the literary careers of many other poets. He advanced a modern movement in English and American literature, key figure in the Imagist movement, And there is an example of imagism, which I told you I would be taking up later on. It's a very short poem, a 2-line poem in a station of the metro, but a very, very important short poem which makes the message of the Imagist movement very clear. Not to indulge in abstraction, a direct treatment of the thing, and a very, clarity of expression. So here, in a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So the setting is a crowded subway station, right? And the people, their faces, they are akin to, they are juxtaposed with the petals on a tree branch. So that is one image which he picks up and treats in this short poem. And as discussed before, generally the Imagist movement uh, looked back to the Japanese haiku poetry, and here also we can feel the same effect. Found, promoted, and occasionally helped to shape the works of such widely different poets and novelists such as W.B. Yeats, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, Frost, Lawrence, and Eliot. So that is how he remains a very, very seminal, a very key figure in the modernist movement, because he helped launch the careers of many a poet. He helped, spearhead the literary careers of many. But his pro-fascist broadcasts in Italy earned him criticism, invited the wrath of many, and that led to his post-war arrest and confinement until 1958. W.B. Yeats and Robert Frost also accepted his editorial advice from him. He was a champion of T.S. Eliot and had a major role in getting the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock published, apart from, of course, The Wasteland, which he had edited. Right? Yes, coming. So we are done with the major poets of the era, and now we are going to talk about the major dramatists. Eugene O'Neill, a very, very important figure. He was the son of Irish immigrants and introduced psychological and social realism to the American stage. By 1922, he was, just 34 years old, and he had already won the Pulitzer Prize for drama twice. Reinvented the legitimate American theater, because before this, American theater was more about melodrama, it was more about farce, and did not, playwrights did not pursue it as a very, very serious vocation. And whereas Eugene O'Neill, used this as a vehicle for social protest. And he was the only American playwright to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and the only dramatist to have won 4 Pulitzer Prizes. Awarded the Nobel Prize in 1936. Of course, there would be more Americans who won the Nobel Prize afterwards, but by that time. And he used the American vernacular, the colloquial language, vernacular, slang, and his characters generally came from the marginalized sections of the society. He would deal more with the underdogs of the society. And most of his plays involved revolved around the social issues, concerns like drunkenness, prostitution, revenge, repressed desire. Guilt, fury, despair, the need for pity, forgiveness. These are O'Neill's great themes. But you see, when you read his plays, these are some of the central concerns. And despite the efforts of the protagonists to, for forgiveness, for finding a place for themselves, for coming out of despair and hopelessness, they are not able to, you know, to find that. In fact, they become more and more mired. It's like a labyrinth. These feelings of these combined feelings of guilt, fury, despair, depression, frustration, all these become a kind of a vicious circle, and they're not able to come out of it. In spite of his success, O'Neill had a very unhappy personal life. There were marital struggles, estranged relationships, there were bouts of mental illnesses in his home, and he himself struggled with depression, illness, after he lost, his children, his other family members within a span of 3 years. So largely he remained a very aloof, alienated figure himself. His first popular hit was The Emperor Jones in 1920, followed by a string of plays including Anna Christie and Desire Under the Ems in 1924. The Emperor Jones, a very interesting play, a very interesting one where there is a man called Brutus Jones, who is an African American who has killed a fellow, being a friend probably in the dice game. He murdered him, and then he ran off from the prison. He ran off and he comes to a place where, by virtue of manipulation, and he becomes the emperor. So there is a tribe, there's a clan living there, and they take him for the emperor. So he has this period of unbridled freedom afterwards, which he enjoys till the time comes, when he has done all the wrongs, people are after him, and he has spread this myth, this rumor, that he cannot be killed except by the silver bullet. In fact, the silver bullet was the original title of this play, The Emperor Jones. So he is running into the forest. He wants to escape. And there in the forest, he undergoes 6 hallucinations. He is reminded of his collective past, collective history, and ultimately, he is killed by those people by a silver bullet. So guilt, redemption is just not possible for him. It's too late for it. And this was the playwright's first foray into expressionist writing, originally called The Silver Bullet, as I just told you. And he used the technique of expressionism and realism. And, he would be talking of expressionism, and he would be incorporating expressionism and realism in many of his plays. And he would also, in this play, he used unreliable narrator, and he used multiple points of view. Another play for which he is very famous is The Hairy Ape, is a 1922 expressionist play. And when we are talking of expressionism, it's basically a revolt against realism, revolt against naturalism of the previous era. I'm sure you have covered realism. And it was a reaction against the materialism, the bourgeois, complacent, bourgeois mentality or prosperity. It was a reaction against rapid mechanization and industrialization, and it was a drama of protest. Expressionism, see, as it was not a literary movement initially. It was a German movement, and it expressed itself in the form of art and paintings. There is a very famous painting, you might have, it's a lithograph. You might have heard of Edward Munch's The Scream, where there is an oblong face, which seems to be screaming. So what expressionist writers, later on they ventured into and extended expressionist art into the field of literature, also into the field of plays also. So there are many dramatists and playwrights who use the expressionist techniques in their plays. Expressionism means they are focusing not on the externals, they are focusing more on the inner turmoil, the psychological crisis going on inside, and in fact, the characters which For example, Eugene O'Neill, he creates in his plays, they are more of types, they are representatives, they are not, particular individualized characters, but rather they represent, types. So they are not fully developed individual, because the idea is not to focus on realism. The idea is not to focus on just the external circumstances. The idea is to convey the inner feelings of the characters. So they were concerned with the general truths rather than the particular ones, and emphasis was on the, not on the outer world, but on the inner world of the characters. This play, The Hairy Ape, this is again a very interesting also, but intriguing also, but disturbing as well. So there is this a man, Yank, who works on an ocean liner, who is very self-assured about himself, who is very assured of his position as a worker on, as a stoker on an ocean liner. But what, how his life is shattered, how he is shaken out of this relatively stable life, is when a woman visits, and she calls him a filthy beast. That is what disturbs him, that is what shakes him completely. And he begins, questioning about his identity. He undergoes an identity crisis. What is his position in the society? And he very vehemently, decides to take revenge on this woman and her father, who belong to the capitalist class. So there is this tussle between the capitalist class and the proletariat, the working classes. But in the course of the play, you also realize that he is a misfit who is just not able to um, find meaning anywhere in the society, be it any other organization. He wants to join some organization by which he can, seek vengeance on this lady and her father. He wants to wreak havoc on their business, completely, destroy it. But ultimately, what he realizes is that he is living a very meaningless life. He is a misfit, and he goes to visit a zoo where he finds a gorilla, and somehow, he feels that he can more, the most he can associate with is not with a, it's not, he cannot build any association with a human being, but perhaps he can have some association, some relation with this gorilla. And the ending is very surreal, because ultimately gorilla overpowers him, and he opens the cage, gorilla overpowers him and ultimately kills him. So this is not a very realist situation, because the idea is to display the internal struggles of this character Yang. Sir, please allow me to put my laptop on charger. It's been quite some time and it's running out of
No issues.
battery. Just a minute.
Okay, ma'am.
Electra Desire under the M's, where he uses Greek mythology also. So Eugene O'Neill remains at the helm. When we talk of American playwrights, he holds a very, very important place in that, genre. Then is Susan Glaspell. We would be covering the dramatist today. I think it's time is already 12:15, so we would be covering, there is one more, and we can take up the novelists and the Harlem Renaissance and the Beat generation the next time we meet. So I would be talking about the remaining two dramatists. This is Susan Glaspell, whose Trifles is a one-act play, and it is about the investigation of the murder of a man called John Wright. John Wright and Minnie Wright is, his wife. There is an investigation, but this can be called as one of the early feminist plays. It is about a murder, and of course, wife is the prime suspect. And the play begins with an abandoned old farmhouse of John Wright and Minnie Wright, and there is a sheriff, there is an attorney who come for investigation. They are accompanied by their wives, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. But what is the difference between the investigation? These men, for them, this investigation is a very cold, emotionless, it's just a job for them. They are not bothered about the reasons, about finding the reasons for the murder. Whereas you see a completely different attitude of their wives, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, when they are on this investigation spree. They find a lot of evidences which go on to state, which go on to prove that there must have been some reasons, why Minnie Foster had killed her husband. And in the course of the investigation, they also find a strangulated bird, and they can safely assume that the bird must have been killed by her husband, and in a fit of rage, fury, and collective anger of so many years of having been subservient to her husband, who might have been abusive also. She, in a fit of rage, and she, in after in a bout of depression, must have killed her husband. So these women, they are looking at the same event, same situation, from a very different perspective, from a feminist perspective, whereas the men are very cold and unemotional about the entire event. And ultimately, these women, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, they try to hide the evidence so as to save Minnie Foster from imprisonment, from the charge of murder. And this play is frequently anthologized in a lot of textbooks. Last but not the least of the dramatists is Clifford Odets. He was an American playwright, screenwriter, and director in the mid-1930s. He was widely seen as the potential successor to Nobel Prize-winning playwright Eugene O'Neill. But eventually we see he somehow faded into oblivion. From January 1935, his socially relevant dramas were very influential. Why he was considered as a successor to Eugene O'Neill was also because of the fact he was also writing, about social issues. And after the production of his play Clash by Night, he focused his energies primarily on the film projects. He remained in Hollywood for the next 7 years, and also inspired writers like Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller, again, is a very, very famous writer who wrote such works as we discussed one, Death of a Salesman. There's another one, The Crucible by Arthur Miller. His prominence was eventually eclipsed by Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams. So there came on the stage a lot of other figures who eventually, not consciously, but pushed, Clifford Odets into oblivion. The House Committee on Un-American Activities initiated its Hollywood investigation in October 1947. This is one thing I want to talk about in detail, but we can talk about the House American, the McCarthy era, or the Red Scare in the United States in the 1950s. Later, when we talk about Allen Ginsberg, because their poetry, Allen Ginsberg's poetry, or the Beat Generation writers were writing during those unpredictable times during the Red Scare or the McCarthy era. So it would make more sense if I take it up then, right? And sir, you have to tell me whether you want me to continue, or we can continue the session next time.
Ma'am, it depends on you. We can go ahead for 5-10 minutes more if you want, or we can stop.
Okay, we can cover one or two major novelists then.
Okay, ma'am. Or you can start with the novelist in the next session.
Yeah, that is what I am saying. So we can, we have covered poets and dramatists. We can take up novelists next time when we meet.
Yeah. In the meanwhile, I have asked,
Okay.
Yes. There is a question about throwing some light on James Joyce and his style of writing, especially the use of psychoanalysis.
I have not covered James Joyce here. But we can talk about James Joyce as well. Uh, Ulysses and his style of writing, stream of consciousness. So if we have time, in the next session, I guess we are getting a little late as I have, an engagement at 12:30, and I had scheduled my, this thing accordingly. So we got a little late, but we can definitely talk about James Joyce. Do students have any questions?
Yeah, some light, if you would like to throw on vorticism, and is it different from imagism?
Okay. Vorticism is actually not manifested in literature per se. Vorticism, cubism, futurism, these are not manifested in literature because there were some isms, which started, which manifested in paintings, in the visual arts, right? And then later on, they were extended to literature. So, Vorticism, to be honest, I have not come across any literary work which was influenced by Vorticism, because futurism, of course, we have some, works which can be called, which can be considered as belonging to futurism, but cubism, vorticism, as far as I know, do not reflect much in literature. And obviously, imagism is a literary movement. It was an Anglo-American literary movement, and that's what I think. It suffices.
Okay, ma'am. So with that, we close this session, and we will come back to your session day after tomorrow at 6. And I'm sure in that session, there'll be much more participation. As I informed you, we generally have 85 participants. And
Right.
so far, this is the, technically, we have in American literature course, we have the least number of registrations. Otherwise, this is our 7th course, and we have had around, in overall, if you consider, we have had so far more than 2,200 registrations. So
That's an amazing number.
yeah, that's amazing. But we expected in American literature more participation.
And of course, you
Because
feel, your effort worthwhile. Or also, if there are participants, if they are participating, if they are benefiting from the lecture, as many as they can. And American literature is very, very interesting, intriguing. I am quite fascinated by American literature because there are a lot of nuances. I mean, this much of time, of course, does not suffice, and we cannot, include everything. But it's just a broad overview of what American literature is about and how it got reflected in the modernist era. So yeah, I would
definitely,
love to have
ma'am.
more participants the next time.
Yeah, we with that thought in mind, we had gauged this. We had designed this particular course. Of course, depends. There are some exams going on at some places, so we don't know exactly. But yeah, this is something which is very important. We are quite one course we had organized in the month of December end, and that was on history of ideas. We dealt with the various ideas.
Yeah, in fact, one of my colleagues had participated. In fact, head of the department, Mrs. Neena Sharma. She, in fact, told me, because we were just discussing that there is this lecture, and she told me that you have been organizing, series of online lectures, and she was a part of it, and she was highly appreciative, and she told how it's very well managed, and they rope in good people, to deliver lectures, and those are quite relevant.
We try our best. Like after this lecture series, we are organizing a series on movements and schools. So the
Okay.
various movements in schools right from the 16th century till the
Right, right.
21st century.
And that is, I think, very, very, that would be beneficial for students, who are eyeing to clear net exams also. I
Yeah,
mean, these courses, if they have completed a few courses, I mean, it covers a lot, especially from the point of view of net exams or any other, state exams, SLET or other such
definitely.
competitive
And
exams.
those are also prescribed in your regular graduation and MA programs as well. So we have, made a very comprehensive list. We have worked on it and we are almost finalizing it. And
I'm
within a
sure.
day or two,
It's a
we
lot of
may,
hard work, because when you conceptualize a thing, when you
yeah,
conceive of a thing, and when you execute it, I mean, a lot goes into that process. So it's quite an elaborate one, time consuming, where you're putting a lot of efforts as to what.
absolute honor and pleasure to have you, and looking
Thank you
forward
so
for
much.
the second
Thank you
engagement
so much.
session on
Sir, there's
6th.
one question. Is there a
Yeah,
recording of this session as well?
yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Would you be providing?
So
All
much.
right.
It was a
Thank you.
pleasure
Sure.
having you. Thank you so much. Meet you soon in the next session. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, ma'am.